Welcome to the Fright Lab. I'm Lucas Yoakum. And with me tonight is Joseph Wren, who, hey, what's up with that weird book? Should you be reading that?
Conda. I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to read this book bound in human flesh out loud ever. They never said what would happen if somebody couldn't speak but decided to sign the words. That's always been my question. Does Sam Raimi show up on his lawnmower if I sign the words that I see on the page?
You know, that's an interesting question. Like, I'm no expert at American Sign Language. I'm no student of it. But I feel like if you're trying to do the sign language equivalent of the invocation in the Necronomicon, it involves a knife. I don't know why that is, but that just seems like it's the only possible explanation.
Remember, Lucas, it is not hands that call us. It is
desire.
Desire.
Okay, so we're going to get away from that impersonation because that's not what we're talking about on this episode. In fact, tonight, well, let's just go out and say it. We're talking the Necronomicon. And that means we got to talk about the Evil Dead. Now, I don't need to tell fans of the show about the Evil Dead, right? I'm going to go on a limb and say we've all seen at least one Evil Dead movie.
Probably Evil Dead 2.
No, we'll get there. As a franchise, The Evil Dead has been testing the boundaries of mainstream acceptability since about 1981. It's a great formula. A simple, repeatable set of concepts. Put its protagonists in hideous, existentially dangerous situations and cover them in gore from what appears to be a fire hose. Sometimes it's funny, sometimes it's terrifying, but it's always an outlandish experience that borders on the surreal. Or, in other words, The Evil Dead rules. But what's at the heart of The Evil Dead as a series? How does this ball get rolling in every film? Or, for that matter, video game or television series? You could argue that Ash Williams, portrayed by the utterly inimitable Bruce Campbell, was the heart and soul of the series, but with the 2013 reiteration as well as Evil Dead Rise and the forthcoming Evil Dead Burn, Ash is not really with us on screen anymore, even though we know he's there in spirit. But they also have Campbell being the executive producer of the most recent movies, so, there's that either way.
And a post-credits cameo. Don't forget about that.
Utterly unnecessary, but
literally
whatever.
Doesn't matter, but if you're going to go there, you might as well.
Sure. No siblings. The heart of darkness at the center of the Evil Dead series, the singular power with sinister gravity, is the Naturam de Monto, a.k.a. Necronomicon Ex Mortis, a.k.a. the Book of the Dead. Bound in human flesh and inked in blood, this diabolical tome has led to on-screen chaos, violence, and horror virtually impossible to imagine. We are incredibly lucky that such a nightmarish thing exists purely in the realms of fiction only. Or does it? The Book of the Dead, as it's portrayed in the Evil Dead canon, is mostly a work of fiction. But its roots run much deeper than you might imagine. And it's from this hideous text that we can leap once more into the darkness. And to do so, we're going to have to answer a handful of questions. First, just what the hell is the Necronomicon? To do that, we will not only be diving into some cinematic lore, but into some legitimate literary history. Next, where does the idea of a book with dark magical powers come from? I have what I suspect is a pretty solid theory about this. And lastly, I want to go back to the subject that we've kind of covered before, and that's cursed media. For reference, that's episode 25. Regarding that, I want to ask why the idea of cursed media continues to pop up in horror media. So with all of that out of the way, I feel like we need to talk a little bit about the Evil Dead, if only to help us contextualize this whole thing. So pile into your favorite blue mid-70s sedan and head with us into the woods.
Legend has it that it was written by the Dark Ones. Necronomicon ex mortis. Roughly translated, Book of the Dead. The book served as a passageway to the evil worlds beyond. It was written long ago, when the seas ran red with blood. It was this blood that was used to ink the book. In the year 1300 AD, the book disappeared.
Fans of the Evil Dead canon will know that that's the intro to Evil Dead 2, arguably the most popular of the series. Joe, it is time for you to take a stand. What's your favorite of the Evil Dead movies?
With as much time as I have spent with all of my friends watching over and over Evil Dead 2, I have to stand and say that Evil Dead 2 is my favorite of the films in this series. I think it's an interesting story to tell, how Sam Raimi legitimately wanted to make a disturbing independent horror film, and The Evil Dead stands on its own. The Evil Dead 2 recaps it a little bit and then goes in the direction of absurd, but it stays in the scary. Army of Darkness, as much as I enjoy it for what it is, it shows me the man who would eventually make Xena Warrior Princess.
Sure. No, I totally agree with that.
Even Ash vs. Evil Dead, I'm cool with it because it continues the tone of Evil Dead 2. I think Evil Dead 2 is the film that explains what this is, and it is my favorite film. It just has been replayed to death in most social circles. So apologies to everyone whose friends overdid it. Yes, it's a good movie, but it's not that good.
Yeah, I am actually in a very weird position. Of the whole series, how to put this, I'm maybe the most pure on the, I like just the horror side more than the horror comedy side. That fans of the show will know that. That's not a surprise. So I'm actually more of a fan of the original Evil Dead. I think as a horror movie, it's just more effective than the Evil Dead 2. Not to say I don't enjoy Evil Dead 2. It's very good. I do like it. But as Joe put it, it is played to death. We have all seen that movie a million times. Not that it's a bad movie. I'll happily watch it if you put it on right now. But yeah, it's not for me. Now, I will say, I think the latter-day Evil Dead movies, not the Army of Darkness notwithstanding, because it's not really a horror movie. We'll talk about that in a minute. The latter-day Evil Dead films, I'm actually kind of a fan of them. I joked on a previous episode, actually, I just seen Evil Dead Rise, and it's remarkably good, actually. I think it's very, very good. And the 2013 Fede Alvarez, we'll talk about it in a minute. I think it's really good, too.
In a world where remakes have been so fucking overdone, the new Evil Dead films take the original concept, I think, and execute it better for today's audience. If The Evil Dead is a demo, then The Evil Dead is the record that the band has been refining for the past 20 years.
You know, I can kind of see that. Yeah, the 2013 Evil Dead, it is a very different movie than the 1981 Evil Dead. But, you know, it's doing something a little differently. I don't know. It's its own animal. We'll talk about it anyway.
I don't want to spoil the later conversation, my friend.
Exactly.
But Sam Raimi, he should have made Evil Dead 2 when he made Evil Dead 1, and I'm glad he got there.
Yeah. Okay. I'll agree with that. That's fair. I'm going to blow through the plots of these films real quick. Note that I'm going to leave out the video games that are based on the series, as well as the TV show Ash vs. the Evil Dead. 2 reasons. 1, the canon of this series is, well, shaky at best. For reasons I will explain, it's difficult to really set adequate or correct timelines. And the video games, honestly, they just overcomplicate that. As for the TV series, I have to level with you all. I haven't watched it. I know. I'm a bad horror man for that, but I don't have a lot of time for TV series in my life, so I just haven't watched it. Okay. So with that out of the way, I also am going to have to slightly spoil the first few movies. And I know we typically give spoiler warnings. I'm very insistent on that. But the first Evil Dead film is over 43 years old at the time of this recording. If you haven't seen it by now, I genuinely can't help you on this subject. All right, so 1981, The Evil Dead. A group of friends head to a cabin in the woods for a relaxing weekend away. They discover that the original owner, or just another tenant of the cabin, had been an archaeologist researching a text called the Naturom de Monto, which had powers to conjure demons and all other sorts of evil entities. Now, I'm going to blah, blah, blah through some details here. There's demons, a ton of gore, some absolutely primitive but inventive special effects, and almost everyone dies except for Ash. Sort of. The ending of the film is, shall we say, a little ambiguous. Okay, 1984, the sequel arrives. Evil Dead 2. Well, sequel. Sort of. The initial plot of the film is almost identical, but with an initially smaller cast. Ash and his girlfriend go to a vacation at a cabin in the woods originally owned by an archaeologist or anthropologist who was deciphering an evil book, this time called the Necronomicon Ex Mortis. Passages from the book end up conjuring demons, more people end up at the cabin, and only Ash survives. Well, sort of. At the end, he is sucked through a portal meant to send away the evil entities and lands somewhere in medieval Europe. He ends up being seen as some sort of messianic savior guy, I guess, and the movie ends. Evil Dead 2 is still a horror movie, but it has a lot of absurdist slapstick moments. Genuinely funny, by the way. Evil Dead 2 might be the best example of horror comedy, and it's definitely setting the stage for stuff like Tucker and Dale, you know? All right, in 1993, we get Army of Darkness. This movie represents the biggest departure for the whole series. It's loaded with many gags and visuals that wouldn't be too far removed from Evil Dead 2. There are definitely horror elements in the film, yes, but here again, it's mostly a comedy. It's also set in a fantasy, swords and sorcery type setting, but here again, it's almost totally a comedy. And that's not to say I don't love this movie. Army of Darkness is practically comfort food for me. Anyway, Army of Darkness. Ash fights across this fantasy landscape to reclaim the Necronomicon, battle with a literal army of skeletons and demons, and hopefully manage to get back to the modern era and restart his life. Okay, fast forward. It's 2013. We get like a reboot, reiteration, remanifestation of the series, simply called Evil Dead. To avoid any confusion, we're going to call this Evil Dead 2013. So in Evil Dead 2013, we lose the entire original cast of characters. We get the cabin, and we do get a group of young people. We also get the Demontum Natoro found in a basement, apparently after some real bad shit happened down there. And our group of bright young things aren't there for our country holiday. No. They're there to help their friend Mia kick an apparently terrible opiate habit. This would not be a fun weekend under any circumstances. I've never gone through opiate withdrawal, but I understand. Not a great time. The addition of a demon conjuring manual that leads to the brutal mutilation and murder of a social circle, well, that'll just fucking ruin your time off from work. You know what I mean? I'm not going to expressly spoil this movie. If you're a fan of the series and haven't seen it, well, you know, you can kind of figure it out if you've seen any other movie. That said, I'm a pretty big fan of Evil Dead 2013. I think it's actually inventive, and it is seriously unrelenting. It was directed by Fede Alvarez, and he knows a thing or two about horror. If you've not seen this movie, guys, get on it. Finally, 2023, Evil Dead Rise. I was genuinely surprised at how much I enjoyed this movie. It takes the formula of the series and adds a new twist on it. Instead of the book being discovered in a lonely, dilapidated cabin, the book is discovered beneath a nearly dilapidated or falling into disuse apartment building. Chaos, of course, ensues. The considerably tightened quarters of the film results in a sort of claustrophobia on top of the traditional fire hose of viscera that the Evil Dead films are known for. Honestly, I kind of have high hopes for any additional films continuing to come out in this series, and that's very rare when it comes to remakes. I think with Raimi and Campbell involved, even if they're like just in a production position, the film can keep its spirit, demonic or otherwise, and thereby innovate the story in a sincere and interesting way. Okay, great. What about the book? You all know the movies and can probably quote the scripts for me almost in whole sections. So what about the book? Or should I say the books? So I want you to think for a minute about the first Evil Dead film. The book in Evil Dead is called the Necronomicon de Monto, and that roughly translates to dismantle nature. So I want you to think about it for a second. The film has been historically tied to cabins in the woods. The demonic presence, called at points Kandarian demons, emerges in the form of trees, of river-damaged bridges, of the muck of bogs, and the dirt of the earth. In different hands, I think a fictional object like the Necronomicon de Monto would end up creating a folk horror thing, about an evil power tearing apart or corrupting nature and ruining man's place in it. But the Evil Dead isn't really about that sort of subtlety. Instead, it takes the already sometimes inhospitable sides of nature and turns those amps up to 11. Hell, there's a scene in one Evil Dead movie that visually shows you the name of a fucking Slayer track. If you know, you know. But even that's a little hazy, okay? Some sources online that I have seen say that the actual name of the book in the first Evil Dead film is Necronomicon de Montum, which would mean something like Nature of the Mountain. And that doesn't really jive with the rest of the movies, right? I'm obviously not Sam Raimi, so I don't honestly know what was intended there. If that was maybe a mispronunciation or a misreading or whatever. So if you have like an original copy of the script or you're Sam Raimi, Sam, can I call you Sam? You should email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com and correct us and inform us. And Mr. Raimi, please, would you give us an interview? I would really appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Raimi. Anyway.
So about that scene in Spider-Man 2, I have questions.
Okay, can we talk about that? Can we talk about some Doctor Strange? Like, listen, I don't even like Marvel movies, but I want to talk to you about Doctor Strange.
Listen, if Doc Ock is inhabited by the Evil Dead, I feel like that is the fan rewrite that needs to exist.
We're going to talk after we finish recording this episode, okay? We need to talk about this idea. What were we talking about? Okay, so why does everyone then talk about the book and call it the Necronomicon? There are two reasons here that I can point to. The obvious one is that the book is called the Necronomicon in the second Evil Dead and in Army of Darkness. But once we get to Evil Dead 2013 and Evil Dead Rise, boom, it's back to Necronomicon de Monto. Weird, but whatever. Okay, what about the name Book of the Dead? Well, that's even more hazy, and I'll get into that in a minute. The second reason that the term the Necronomicon comes up, I think, connects the film to another piece of horror history, specifically the writings of Howard Philip Lovecraft.
This exists, by the way. I'm sorry to derail you, but the H.P. Lovecraft Society did a self-funded, complete audiobook reading of all the fiction of H.P. Lovecraft.
Well then, you downloaded it?
I paid for it.
Yeah.
I paid I think $30 or
That's
maybe
not
$40.
bad. That's not bad.
No, it was absolutely worth it.
I was going to say my hardbound, like, massive tome of the complete works of H.P. Lovecraft cost that much. So yeah, that tracks. A while back, I said that I didn't know when I would eventually touch on Lovecraft with this podcast. Truthfully, I'm not sure that my points here will really adequately cover him either. Lovecraft looms large in the world of English language horror media. When you think about cosmic-sized nightmares, or honestly just plain old tentacles, Lovecraft is the name invoked. In fact, I think in the last 10 years, I've heard the term Lovecraftian or Cthulhu entirely more than is really necessary. But I want to take a second here to deal with the elephant in the room when it comes to Lovecraft. It's been long documented that Lovecraft was a cosmic-sized bigot for most of his life. He held views that are positively appalling now, and even in his lifetime, they might have been seen as a little extreme. It's hard to say that his views ever improved at any point. I have seen some excerpts of correspondence from him where it seems like he might have been slowly changing about that near the end of his life. He seemed to be softening some and admitting that he was wrong. But it's nothing that we would call like a full repudiation of his former worldviews, right? Nothing that I've seen anyway. I've not read his entire correspondences. Make of that what you will. Typically, I am a death of the author guy, and that means that I can separate the art from the artist in some, if not most, cases. With Lovecraft, I find that a little harder to do. Face it, there's some baked in and deeply fucked up racism in many of his stories. I guess that many people will have to put Lovecraft down as a problematic favorite category, something that they enjoy, but they admit is a little rough. And I don't necessarily think that's wrong either. I'm still a fan of many of his stories, but I'm also fully cognizant of how many of them are just plain ugly. I think that the organizers of the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival have a good viewpoint with their namesake's beliefs. I'm quoting from their website here. We embrace his contributions to the genre, the bleakness of his horror, the coolness of his monsters, but we firmly reject his racist ideologies. We believe that the best way to honor his legacy is to discuss and confront the whole person openly. And they go on to say, his views were likely the product of his upbringing and a relatively insular life, not the product of a uniformly racist culture. And we believe that this kind of thinking not only lets HPL off the hook, but also lets an entire generation of Americans off the hook for reinforcing some of the systemic injustices still in place today. I think that's a pretty fair perspective. One can quibble or argue about some points there, but I think they're onto something there. I have included a link to their statement in the show notes, and I strongly encourage you give it a read in its entirety. And so it is explicitly said, we reject Lovecraft's racist viewpoints. On this show, we think racism is anti-intellectual bullshit and won't tolerate it or any other sort of bigotry. So if you have those views, sorry, we don't fucking agree with you. With that much needed point out of the way, we need to talk about Lovecraft's connection to the second and third Evil Dead films, and really to the series as a whole. The Necronomicon, as an idea, as a fictional device, emerges from Lovecraft completely. He needed a spooky tome to show up in his stories, and like so many other things, he just sort of tied one text to multiple stories he wrote and to multiples of his creations. And that book, the Necronomicon, worked for him. The name of the book is interesting. Most people translate it as Book of the Dead, but again, like I said earlier, that's kind of a misnomer and a conceptual error. We're going to cover that in a bit.
It sounds good when you're reading it for the beginning of your film. It's not necessarily accurate.
Hell yeah. It's a spooky sounding name. It sounds cool, right? Okay. A more accurate reading of the name Necronomicon would be Book of Dead Names. Allegedly, Lovecraft's Necronomicon was written in the Middle East, disappears a handful of times, and then eventually finds its way to the fictional Miskatonic University in America. Along the way to Miskatonic, it encounters a number of famous occultists like John Dee and probably just kind of stirs up madness wherever it lands. Here again, that's giving me a yada 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 kind of thing. It's a brief explanation. The full Lovecraft write-up about the Necronomicon, the kind of the lore, the backstory of it, is linked in the show notes. Go give it a read. Okay, at any rate, there was some reason for Raimi to rename the book in his movies. Now, I've heard rumors that it was an issue with the rights to the first film, and therefore, he couldn't use the same thing in the second and third movie. I've never seen definitive proof of that, but that's what I've always heard, and it makes sense. Also, I am not convinced that Raimi was all that concerned with plot continuity in the first two movies, so does it even matter? I don't think it does. And clearly, he wrote multiple scripts around it. So make of that what you will.
It's one of the best parts of the Evil Dead film franchise. The end result is this badass character of Ash that Bruce Campbell gets to portray on multiple occasions, but it also gives us a concept that I love. And I could make fun of this in another medium, but in Evil Dead, I love the fact that the Evil Dead, whatever it is, cannot be defeated. It doesn't permanently go away, and it's always going to be there. It's like It Follows. It doesn't matter what Bruce Campbell does in any of those movies, he doesn't really defeat the Evil Dead. He just gets it to step back for a second.
Right. We should swing back for just a split second to the Notorum de Monto and the Necronomicon. So it changes appearances a couple of times, and outside of, conjuring evil, it seems to kind of do different things. Like the book itself does different things. So, Evil Dead Rise. The book literally has fucking teeth, and the binding, like the edges of the binding, are the gums for the teeth. In Evil Dead 2013, it doesn't have that, but it's clearly made of flesh and is wrapped in barbed wire, which, for the record, if you ever find a book that probably smells a little funny and is wrapped in barbed wire, don't open it. It is wrapped in barbed wire for a reason. Do the right thing. Leave it alone. Okay. Army of Darkness. The book has a mouth and teeth on the cover. The detail of it being bound in flesh and inked in blood still holds across all of the copies, but outside of that, the continuity of the Necronomicon is kind of all up in the air. Now, personally, I like the fan theory that there's just multiple copies or multiple editions of the Necronomicon floating around out there, causing havoc wherever they end up. And I've read that fan theory more than once. It's not just something I came up with or something I saw once. But here again, I'm not sure that the name or the appearance were really something that the creators of the films were concerned with. Okay, cool. Let's go on. What about the name The Book of the Dead? Well, that's a little more complex. And in my opinion, a little more of a fascinating angle. So, let's get weird and esoteric, shall we? When you are using the term The Book of the Dead outside of horror movie circles, you're typically referring to one of two texts. You are referring to the so-called Egyptian Book of the Dead or the so-called Tibetan Book of the Dead. They're very different. Well, sort of. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, it would be more proper and more correct to refer to the name of this text as the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was compiled across a number of varying papyri throughout ancient Egyptian history, specifically during the New Kingdom period. So kind of, I don't want to say the end of ancient Egypt, but closer to the end than to the beginning. The text was primarily spells and prayers and incantations for an Egyptian priest to properly pass through the underworld into a post-mortem paradise of sorts. The best known copy was compiled and originally translated by a British expert named E.A. Wallace Budge, and now his translation would be considered somewhat faulty. It's not always considered great. It's been studied and retranslated extensively, and a quick Google search will push you towards good starting points on that. Just because it's kind of a funny aside, I do own a copy of the Budge Book of the Dead. You can find it anywhere. I literally found it over the summer at a garage sale. So, that should give you an idea. Someone told me the other day that they actually found a hardbound copy of it at Five Below. So, who knows, right?
We've gone to meme territory at this point.
It is, honestly, yeah. The Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is kind of well into meme territory. Now, that having been said, having thumbed through and read chunks of the Book of Coming Forth by Day, it's a really beautiful text, actually. It's very fascinating, and reading it will tell you something about the later periods of ancient Egyptian history, kind of their mythological worldview. It's cool. It's worth seeing. Okay, the Tibetan Book of the Dead then. Okay, so the original name of the text in Tibetan is Bardo Todal, or in English, Liberation Through Hearing During the Intermediate State. Doesn't quite roll off the tongue the way Book of the Dead does, but whatever. I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. The text comes from a larger set of Tibetan Buddhist Dharma texts related to what they call self-liberation. The text is designed to aid a recently dead or currently dying person into the best possible state post-mortem. In this case, ideally to reach nirvana, and if not that state, then a preferable reincarnation. Now, so it's said, obviously, I am not an expert on either of these texts, or any other text called the Book of the Dead, for that matter, because apparently there are many religions that have similar texts. What we're talking about here is the classical idea of the funerary texts, which are something that seem to kind of weirdly unite religions in a way. It's a fascinating subject, and one that I would genuinely like to learn about more someday. Think about it. Catholics have the last rites, Tibetan Buddhists have the Bardo Todal. Very different books, but ultimately they're their own specialty thing. Okay, so you've got a book to help dead people, but what about a spooky book of demonic conjuration? Neither the Bardo Todal nor the Book of Coming Forth by Day fit the bill. If you're looking for that sort of thing, well, you're going to have to go to a different time and place, specifically Europe, several centuries back. Humans have believed in magic since time immemorial. The notion of finding ways to gain influence over one's own life, or other people's lives, through less than normal means is something that even modern people seek today. Think about books like How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's kind of there, right? And once humans began writing, they began transmitting these supposed methods through the written word. They became so prevalent in Europe that there became a French word to describe books of magic: grimoire.
It's one of my favorite French words.
It's a beautiful word in its own kind of way. It's deeply evocative, I think. So, trying to create some sort of canonical list of medieval and Renaissance grimoires would be way outside of the scope of a single podcast episode. This tradition, this grimoire tradition, as it's sometimes referred, is an absolutely fascinating part of the religious tradition that is prevalent in Judaism and in Christianity, which admittedly seems on its face kind of strange, right? Why would books that detail the ability to conjure demons, or anything else for that matter, be a part of Judeo-Christian and, yes, even Islamic heritage that goes across the world, and specifically what we're talking about here in Europe. Well, that's because demonic conjuration is only a fraction of the desired outcomes that these books attempt to transmit. Belief in demons? Complicated subject. But the grimoire tradition is loaded with all sorts of concepts that wouldn't seem all that weird in a modern environment or in a modern context. These texts were written or compiled by educated people, many of whom were deeply religious. You could even describe them as pious. They received extensive religious education, and that allowed them to help contextualize these ideas and then eventually create these texts. You also have to consider that most of these books were not made for common people. Just statistically speaking, if you're listening to this podcast, you wouldn't have been in the correct socioeconomic status to be reading a lot of written or printed material. In many parts of Europe at this time, to be educated meant intrinsically upper class or religious prelate. In many cases, we're talking, again, deeply pious individuals, and these are the sort of people who, by contrast to the rest of their peerage, would be living lives of relative luxury or relative comfort. Arguably, the best example of this is Dr. John Dee, who I referenced earlier with discussions of the Necronomicon. Dr. Dee was a demonstrably real person. He's a historical character. He served in the court of Queen Elizabeth I as a court astrologer. He was a cartographer. He was a code breaker. He's just incredibly fascinating figure. Dee had one of the largest libraries in Europe at the time and is sometimes considered the father of this idea of the British Empire. Dee was also very deeply into alchemy and Hermetic philosophy. He attempted to combine what he perceived to be all esoteric knowledge into a single concept, the hieroglyphic monad. And what is the hieroglyphic monad? Siblings, I gotta level with you. I will not even attempt to begin insulting your intelligence with such a fumbling explanation of the hieroglyphic monad. I've tried reading several good texts on this principle, and it felt like I was reading a foreign language. Have you ever had one of those moments when you realize you are just completely out of your depth? Like if you opened a book expecting it to be written in English only to discover that it is written in Swahili or Japanese, and you just don't know what you're dealing with.
What do you mean the manga is read right to left instead of left to right, Lucas?
Only worse, and not like a manga at all.
So upside down? With a black light in a dark room?
Why are you doing this to me, Joe? All right, anyway, that experience, totally out of your depth, that's me trying to learn about the hieroglyphic monad. Outside of mainstream history, Dee is perhaps best known for developing a system of conjuration and communication with angels. This system, best known as the Enochian system, is a fascinating and extremely complex development in religious methodology. Again, Dee was a cryptographer by training, so this system requires a deep knowledge of code breaking to fully get. And again, I am absolutely no expert on code breaking or angels, so I can't really explain here what Dee was doing in that regard. And so I want to wrap this point by trying to answer. Why were grimoires so common that we can talk about them now? And why do people believe in magic? And as a result, why are there modern people still seeking out magic? I think that answer, I think there is an answer that is fairly simple, but like so many simple answers, it has a very deep impact, okay? Put simply, life is hard. Or maybe more directly, life kinda sucks. For most of us, we will spend our days working at the pleasure of others, for pennies on the dollar of actually what we're creating. We have limited time in our life for meaningful pursuits, and that's compounded by whether or not we have families or loved ones to take care of. If you're of a religious persuasion, and let's get real, when most of these grimoires were written, it was expected that you would be of a religious persuasion, you might be tempted to use some sort of shortcuts to communicate with angels or with God itself in an attempt to better understand the world or to find some shortcut to salvation. And one doesn't really need to be tremendously religious to want shortcuts to wealth or influence or knowledge. And all of that is something that grimoires can claim to offer. There is a researcher on religious arcana, Dr. Justin Sledge, who loves to joke about how many grimoires have spells for finding buried treasure. And why not? Who wouldn't want to find a chest of gold doubloons in their backyard? If you're interested in knowing more about this tradition, I really encourage you to check out our show notes. Dr. Sledge runs an amazing YouTube series called Esoterica, where he discusses religious arcana, alchemy, mysticism, philosophy, all with a very educated bent and really witty style. Dr. Sledge is a favorite of mine, and I can't recommend his work enough. I've shared a playlist in the show notes of him talking about magical texts. He's a lot of fun. And Dr. Sledge, if you're listening to this episode and you would like to talk to us, we would like to talk to you, you can contact us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. And also, I've seen a photo of you with Sam Raimi. Can you get us in touch with Sam Raimi? You know, I'm a little fixated here. Maybe I should work on that personally.
Just a little bit. You know, I'm thinking if the mystical grimoires of old are not your style, maybe you would like to take a walk outside with your favorite dowsing rods and then talk to James Randi about how accurate that is.
You know, I'm not going to dive terribly far into the world of James Randi because he's one of those characters who you can talk about for a while. On one hand, I think he's fascinating. Like, man, what a fascinating human being. What a life he's led. But at the same time, cosmic level party pooper, that guy. I know that this episode's running a little long. Writing it, coming up with details about grimoires, and getting the names right of 40-plus-year-old films in a film series, it's just a bigger load than I had anticipated. In the end, as I was writing this, I kept coming back to questions that had already haunted us in episode 25. Why are people so afraid of cursed media? In this case, a text of demonic conjuration. The Evil Dead series is not the only series to feature the Necronomicon. Anything vaguely involving Lovecraft, it'll eventually pop up. But I have to stand by, in this case, my original conclusion. We are afraid of losing control, of losing agency. And I think that the Necronomicon, in any films or books or comics or anywhere else that it pops up, it's especially effective, not just because it makes you lose control, but because of what it makes you do. Most humans aren't violent. Contrary to what some people will tell you, we're actually pretty bad at violence. Doesn't mean that there isn't a vested interest in making people violent or pushing people to violence. But one-on-one, if you put people in a room together and let them talk for a minute, they're just not violent. It's not something we're very good at. Most of us want our friends and our loved ones to be happy and prosperous. Most of us aren't interested in fighting with strangers. We all value our bodily integrity and our bodily autonomy. We're happy in the safety of our homes and apartments and not worried that something is out in the woods, something out there. We're not worried that it's ready to take all of that from us. We know that consciously, rationally. Moreover, maybe the worst possible thing, not just take our lives from us, take ourselves from us. Thankfully, owning a historical text like the Sworn Book of Honorius or the Lesser Key of Solomon, or even the very amusing modern Simon Necronomicon, well, you're not likely to get attacked by a Kandarian demon as a result. I mean, it's not likely. It's not a 0% chance, but You know what? I'm doing my best to not spook the audience here, Joe. I think I'm failing at that. Am I bad at my job? Is that what's happening here?
When you sit down to talk about horror movies and you come around to the Evil Dead franchise, I think you picked the right topic. Let's talk about the Necronomicon. Let's talk about what that means to people. But we haven't really talked about the films. Isn't it interesting that the first Evil Dead film, Sam Raimi, reputation for liking more than one joke in his films, tried to make a serious horror movie, and then almost immediately pivoted and said, you know what? I like funny. I'm going to keep funny in here. Don't take it so seriously. But still, The Evil Dead 2 is frightening at times.
Sure.
Army of Darkness? This is the man who would go on to make Hercules, The Legendary Journeys, Xena Warrior Princess, and if I can remember the name of it,
The Adventures of Briscoe County Jr.
And there's another one. Don't forget about Jack of All Trades, my friend. One of the most underrated series in the Sam Raimi catalog. It's something that it has that vibe of every time Bruce Campbell would show up in one of those series. I don't know that he directed it as much as the influence is there. My point is, the man knew what he liked, and eventually he got the credibility and the pull in Hollywood to do what he wanted. And that's how you get the Evil Dead 2 reference in Spider-Man 2. I love this film series because it's given us three things that it is doing independent things with. The concept of the Evil Dead. The demon, if I can even call it that no matter what the protagonist does not go away. There is no defeating the Evil Dead. Okay. It's like Cthulhu in that way. When you see Cthulhu, that's the end of all existence,
okay,
right?
Hold on. First of all, we need to rewind for a second. You brought up Jack of all trades instead of Burn Notice?
I like Burn Notice and Jack of all trades.
No, hold on. You spent minutes looking up the name Jack of all trades and you overlooked Burn. Man, just when you think you know somebody, just when you think you can trust somebody, did someone bring the Necronomicon in here? What the hell, man?
I thought the book disappeared.
Okay, right.
I am blind after all.
I know.
But you not only have that concept, you have this evil that does not go away. You also have the character of Ash, who's very comedic in his portrayal, but he's the comedic badass.
I think the thing that works for me about The Evil Dead has less to do with Bruce Campbell. I mean, truth be told, like I like Bruce Campbell. I've never seen him in something that I didn't think he was charming and fun in. He's just a good actor. Like when people say he's a B actor, bullshit. He's a much better actor than that. I think the thing that works for me about The Evil Dead is that there is nothing about the series that pulls a punch ever. Like one of the things that I love about once people get possessed by the Kandarian demons is that all bets are off. At no point is the demon trying to be like, no, I'm not possessed. Everything's fine. Their subterfuge always lasts about 3 minutes. And before long, they're called like, what is that line from Evil Dead Rise where one of them refers to the protagonist as titty sucking parasites? And it's just like, fuck, that's harsh, man. Whoa, wait a minute.
And in the entire canon of the Evil Dead concept, Ash is the only person to ward off the demon.
I think maybe that's just because, like, I have this theory about Ash Williams. I think that the swaggering, like, you know, square-jawed American hero persona that he has is just a cover for the fact that by the end of the first film, he is traumatized beyond repair. The only thing left in him is like, I have to protect what little of my psyche still works, because everything he's just seen in the last 24 hours is the most insane thing anyone's ever dealt with. And none of it makes any sense. So I think most of his swagger throughout the series just has to do with the fact that, well, in the words of Ash in the mirror, I don't think so, pal. You just chopped your girlfriend up with a chainsaw. Does that sound fine to you? I think that the entire character of Ash Williams is so secondary to the rest of the series. For me, Evil Dead is kind of taking take the central conceit of The Exorcist. The whole, demonic possession, but none of us are thinking about the demonic possession. We're thinking about your mother sucks cocks in hell. We're thinking about the terrible things that comes out of Reagan's mouth when she's possessed by Pazuzu. I like that here again, the Evil Dead series takes that idea and just opens up the fire hose with it. It is always crazier than it needs to be.
Absolutely.
So, in our last episode, we pointed out it's a new year, and we can say that the Fright Lab will still be around to explore the things that scare us. And one of the things I always want to come back to is asking the question, why? Why do we love these movies so much? What is it about a series like The Evil Dead that sticks around so long? I mean, 1981, that series is as old as me. And I, as many episodes will tell you, am ancient, at least by the standards of podcasting anyway. I think that I love that such a silly movie. Like, let's take away the horror for just a split second and talk about how absurd the Evil Dead series is. For some reason, there's something enduring about that. I don't know. It just makes me happy in a way. It makes me happy to know that there's still something to chew on, disgusting of a word that might be given the subject of the Evil Dead, but it gives us something that works. And in the case of a book with teeth, something to bite down on. So siblings, we also need to ask, what do you think? Is the Naturum de Monto or the Necronomicon or whatever we're calling it this week the scariest of the cursed artifacts? What's your favorite Evil Dead joint? And is the TV series Ash vs. the Evil Dead worth my attention? Should I give it a watch? You need to let us know. You can email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on all major social media outlets as fright_lab_pod or simply by searching The Fright Lab. Trust me, we're there. We are also on Discord. Joe, will you tell the gruesome people where they can find our Discord server and where else they can find the other parts of your creative output?
I wish I was talented enough to say this in reverse with a Kandarian accent to reference the films, but I'm not that talented. I'm definitely not that prepared. So I need everyone to go to discord.thefrightlab.com. It is where we want this conversation to continue, but you can find us on your favorite social media platform. You heard Lucas say it, thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Facebook, the ones that matter. We want to hear from you. And if this is your first episode listening to The Fright Lab, thank you. Welcome. We hope you enjoyed it. If this is not your first episode, thank you for listening. Thank you for being a fan of this show. What I need from all of you now is to take out your phone, scroll to the left, the right, find the place where you can give the 5-star review or the thumbs up. We want to hear from you. We want to know what you think about the Necronomicon, about the Evil Dead, about David Lynch. We talked about him on a previous episode, and we have many more episodes to come. If you like spooky sounds and are a fan of rock and roll music, thedamnitjanets.com is where I have been making some serious, gruesome music with the best band in the world. If you are a fan of all things heavy metal, you need to be listening to all the podcasts we are creating at discussmetal.com. We talk about your favorite bands, my favorite bands, heavy metal topics, and subjects therein. Lucas, please tell everyone how much we appreciate independent artists and independent media.
First things first, if you're wondering what a Kandarian accent sounds like, I want you to imagine French, but from Quebec, Quebecois Francois. Now, imagine that accent, but if your throat was lined with fully opened box cutters. That's what a Kandarian accent sounds like, because I know you're curious. But on to the big question. What about independent media? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is an independent podcast. This is DIY. We're doing it by ourselves. And we couldn't do it without your attention and your love. But that means also that we love DIY media, broadly speaking. So if you are making some sort of independent horror film, some short form or long form series? Are you making some next level dark ambient shit that I should hear? How about some horror punk or metal or hip hop or whatever? We want to know about it. It means the world to us to find out these new episodes, these new concepts. I got recently turned on to the Horror Joy podcast, and you need to go download some episodes from them. They rule. They're awesome. But what that means is that if you are working on one of these projects, reach out to us, thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. We want to give you guys the bandwidth so that other people can hear what you're up to. And finally, as always, the Fright Lab podcast is written by me, Lucas Yoakum, and is produced by Joseph Wren. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we will talk to you all again very soon.
That's Fright Lab for you.